In an affluent suburban neighborhood, Margaret Brooks believes she's caught a thief in the act when she confronts Dr. Celeste Monroe, a black surgeon sitting in what Margaret assumes is her stolen car. Their tense confrontation escalates, fueled by prejudice and misunderstanding, until Margaret calls the police, delaying Dr. Monroe's urgent journey. But Margaret's world takes a shocking turn when she learns that Dr. Monroe was rushing to the hospital to save a critically injured car crash victim, Margaret's own son. What follows is a deeply emotional journey as Margaret is forced to confront her biases, seek redemption, and reevaluate everything she thought she knew. Along the way, both women navigate themes of prejudice, resilience, and the surprising power of empathy to heal not just wounds, but hearts. Margaret Brooks stirred her coffee absent-mindedly, the delicate clink of the spoon against the porcelain cup, the only sound in her otherwise silent kitchen. She glanced out the bay window at her well-manicured lawn and the sleek black SUV parked in her driveway. The vehicle was her pride and joy, a testament to years of hard work and perseverance. Everything in her suburban world seemed perfect, as it should be. Yet Margaret felt a creeping unease. The day had started like any other. She had gone for her morning walk through the quiet streets of Cedar Hills, exchanging polite nods with neighbors. Returning home, she had stepped into her routine, brewing coffee and checking emails. But something nagged at her, a feeling she could not quite name. She chalked it up to the weather, a gray sky casting a moody light over the neighborhood. Setting her mug down, Margaret decided to take the SUV for a wash. She grabbed her purse and keys from the counter and stepped outside. Her breath caught in her throat. The driveway was empty. Margaret blinked, convinced her eyes were playing tricks on her. She scanned the street, half expecting to see the car parked somewhere else, though she had no reason to move it. It was gone. Her heart pounded. She fumbled for her phone and called her husband, who was away on a business trip. When his voicemail picked up, she muttered under her breath, frustrated. "Unbelievable," she said aloud. As Margaret turned to head back inside, she noticed a car idling near the curb, a vehicle that bore an uncanny resemblance to hers. A woman was seated behind the wheel, seemingly focused on her phone or GPS. Margaret's stomach twisted with suspicion. Without thinking, she marched up to the car, her heels clicking sharply on the pavement. She knocked on the window, startling the driver. The woman looked up. She was black, with warm brown eyes and a calm, professional demeanor. She was wearing scrubs, a stethoscope hanging from her neck. For a brief moment, Margaret hesitated, but her suspicion overrode her better judgment. "Excuse me," Margaret said, her tone clipped. "What are you doing in my car?" The woman blinked, clearly taken aback. "Your car?" she asked. "This is my car, ma'am." Margaret folded her arms, her voice rising. "No, that is my SUV. I saw it in my driveway just this morning." The woman frowned, her gaze steady. "I assure you this is my vehicle. I am a doctor on call, and I am on my way to the hospital." Margaret's skepticism flared. "How convenient," she said, reaching for her phone. "I am calling the police." The woman's expression tightened, but she remained composed. "Ma'am, I understand you are upset, but I have a job to do. If you could save it," Margaret interrupted. "I will let the police sort this out." Margaret stepped back, tapping her foot impatiently as she made the call. She could feel her neighbors watching from behind their curtains, their presence an invisible weight on her back. Her thoughts churned. She had heard stories about car thefts in the area, and this situation fit the narrative all too well. 10 minutes later, a patrol car pulled up, its lights flashing. Officer Daniels, a middle-aged man with a no-nonsense demeanor, stepped out. Margaret hurried to meet him, explaining the situation. Officer Daniels turned to the woman in the car. "Ma'am, may I see your license and registration?" The woman nodded, her movements deliberate as she handed over the documents. "My name is Dr. Celeste Monroe. I am a surgeon at Westview General Hospital. I am responding to an emergency call." Officer Daniels studied the paperwork, his brow furrowing. Margaret shifted uneasily, a sliver of doubt creeping into her mind. "I just want to get to the bottom of this," she said, her voice wavering slightly. Officer Daniels returned the papers to Dr. Monroe. "Everything checks out. Ma'am, I am sorry for the inconvenience. You are free to go." Margaret's stomach dropped. "Wait, that is it?" she demanded. "You are just letting her go?" "Mrs. Brooks," the officer said gently, "this vehicle is registered to Dr. Monroe. I suggest you double-check your driveway. Perhaps there has been some misunderstanding." Dr. Monroe rolled down her window, her gaze steady but weary. "I hope your day improves, ma'am," she said before driving off. Margaret stood frozen, embarrassment washing over her in waves. Her neighbors would talk about this for weeks. Back inside, Margaret paced the living room, glancing out the window every few minutes. She thought about Dr. Monroe's calm demeanor and the officer's findings. Could she have been wrong? A knock at the door startled her. She opened it to find Mrs. Harris, her elderly next-door neighbor, holding a tray of cookies. "I thought you might need these," Mrs. Harris said with a kind smile. Margaret flushed. "Thank you," she murmured. As Mrs. Harris left, Margaret sank onto the couch, clutching the tray. The unexpected kindness caught her off guard, a sharp contrast to her own actions that morning. Margaret's phone buzzed. It was a call from Westview General Hospital. Her heart skipped a beat as she answered. "Mrs. Brooks, this is Nurse Coleman," the voice said. "Your son Ethan has been in a car accident. He is in critical condition. We need you to come to the hospital immediately." The phone slipped from Margaret's hand. Her mind raced as she grabbed her keys and rushed out the door, the memory of Dr. Monroe's calm, determined face flashing in her mind. Margaret did not know it yet, but her world was about to collide with Dr. Celeste Monroe's in ways that would change both of their lives forever. Margaret gripped the steering wheel tightly as she sped toward Westview General Hospital. Her thoughts were a chaotic blur of fear, guilt, and disbelief. Ethan, her baby. Her chest ached with the weight of the nurse's words. Critical condition. The phrase echoed in her mind, each repetition a hammer strike against her composure. She tried to push down the rising panic, telling herself he would be fine. He had to be fine. As the hospital came into view, Margaret barely registered the rows of parked cars or the gray facade of the building. She swung into the first open spot, not bothering to straighten her car, and hurried inside. The sterile scent of disinfectant hit her as she entered the lobby. Margaret rushed to the front desk, her voice shaking as she gave Ethan's name. The receptionist's sympathetic expression only deepened Margaret's worry. "He's in surgery," the woman said. "Take the elevator to the 3rd floor, surgical waiting room." Margaret nodded, her stomach twisting. The ride to the 3rd floor felt interminable. The elevator's soft ding as the doors opened startled her, and she stepped out into a quiet hallway. She spotted a sign for the waiting room and hurried in. The room was sparsely populated, mostly families huddled together in quiet support. Margaret took a seat by the window, staring at her trembling hands. A nurse appeared at the door. "Mrs. Brooks?" Margaret shot to her feet. "Yes, that's me. I'm Nurse Coleman. Dr. Monroe is in surgery with your son. She'll update you as soon as possible." Margaret's heart stopped. "Dr. Monroe?" she repeated, her voice barely above a whisper. The nurse nodded. "Yes, she's one of our top surgeons. Ethan is in excellent hands." Margaret sank back into her chair, her head spinning. Of course, it had to be her. The minutes stretched into an agonizing hour. Margaret's mind replayed the morning's events, her accusations, the police officer's quiet rebuke, Dr. Monroe's calm insistence on her mission. Now the same woman Margaret had humiliated was fighting to save Ethan's life. Margaret couldn't sit still. She paced the room, occasionally peeking down the hallway toward the operating rooms. Each step she took felt heavier, her emotions building into a storm she couldn't control. Why had she been so quick to judge? She had always prided herself on being fair and open-minded, yet this morning she had allowed suspicion to cloud her judgment. Finally the door opened, and Dr. Monroe stepped in, still in her surgical scrubs. Her face was calm, but lined with exhaustion. "Mrs. Brooks," she said, her voice steady, "Ethan's surgery went well. He suffered internal bleeding and a collapsed lung, but we were able to repair the damage. He's stable now, but he's still in critical condition. The next 24 hours will be crucial." Margaret felt tears welling in her eyes, relief mixed with guilt, creating a painful knot in her chest. "Thank you," she said, her voice breaking. "Thank you for saving him." Dr. Monroe nodded, her professionalism unshaken. "He's a strong young man. I'll check on him again soon." As she turned to leave, Margaret blurted out, "I'm sorry." Dr. Monroe paused, glancing back. "For this morning," Margaret continued, her voice trembling, I misjudged you. I was wrong, and I am so sorry." Dr. Monroe studied her for a moment, her expression unreadable. "It's been a long day for both of us," she said quietly. "Focus on your son. That's what matters now." She left before Margaret could say anything more. Margaret spent the rest of the night by Ethan's bedside. He was pale and still, tubes and wires connecting him to machines that beeped softly in the background. She stroked his hand, whispering words of encouragement, though her guilt lingered like a shadow. Dr. Monroe's calm professionalism replayed in her mind. Margaret realized how composed the doctor had been, even after the confrontation. Celeste had every right to be angry, yet she had shown nothing but grace. Margaret's heart ached. She had been so wrong. As dawn broke, Margaret stepped outside to stretch her legs. The hospital courtyard was quiet, the first rays of sunlight casting a golden hue over the neatly trimmed bushes and benches. She spotted a nurse sitting nearby, sipping coffee. The woman smiled and nodded at Margaret. "Rough night?" Margaret nodded. "My son, he was in a car accident." The nurse's face softened. "I'm sorry to hear that. How's he doing?" "He made it through surgery," Margaret said, her voice thick. "Thanks to Dr. Monroe." The nurse's eyes lit up. "Dr. Monroe is incredible. She works tirelessly, always going the extra mile for her patients. We're lucky to have her." Margaret hesitated, then asked, "Have you worked with her long?" 3 years, the nurse replied. "She's not just a brilliant surgeon, she's kind too. She started a mentorship program for med students from underrepresented backgrounds. She's one of the good ones." Margaret swallowed hard, the nurse's words deepening her guilt. Back in the waiting room, Margaret saw Dr. Monroe speaking with another family. She looked tired but patient, listening intently to their concerns. Margaret watched her, admiration mixing with shame. She had spent so much of her life protecting her family, her possessions, her carefully curated world. But now she wondered how many times she had jumped to conclusions, how many people she had wronged without even realizing it. Margaret vowed to make things right, not just with Dr. Monroe, but with herself. Margaret sat in the stiff hospital chair by Ethan's bedside, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. The steady rhythm of the heart monitor was both a comfort and a reminder of how fragile the situation was. The room felt unnaturally cold despite the warm sunlight streaming through the blinds. Ethan's pale face, framed by tubes and wires, was almost too much for her to bear. Dr. Monroe's words echoed in her mind. The next 24 hours will be crucial. Margaret adjusted the blanket around Ethan's shoulders, brushing a lock of hair from his forehead. He looked so young, so vulnerable. She had spent the night replaying her confrontation with Dr. Monroe, each detail sharper than the last. Her mind wandered to the stories she had heard about car thefts in the neighborhood, the snippets of news that had planted seeds of fear. She realized now how easily those fears had shaped her perception, blinding her to the truth. As morning wore on, Margaret ventured out of the room to get coffee. She stopped at a vending machine in the hallway, fumbling with the unfamiliar buttons. A nurse passing by offered her a kind smile. "Let me help," the nurse said, inserting a few coins. "Thank you," Margaret murmured, clutching the warm cup. "Is your loved one in recovery?" the nurse asked gently. "My son," Margaret said, her voice trembling. He was in an accident. Dr. Monroe operated on him. The nurse's expression softened. He's in good hands. Dr. Monroe is one of the best. Margaret nodded, trying to smile, but her guilt was heavy. She wanted to say something, to explain herself. But what could she say? The nurse had already walked on, leaving Margaret alone with her thoughts. Back in the waiting room, Margaret noticed a man sitting across from her. He was older, his hands rough and weathered, holding a small bouquet of flowers. Their eyes met briefly, and he nodded. "Your son in surgery?" he asked, his voice gentle. "He just got out," Margaret replied, her voice barely above a whisper. "He's stable now." "That's good to hear," the man said. "My wife is in surgery. Heart trouble." Margaret managed a faint smile. She wanted to offer comfort, but her own emotions were still raw. The man continued. "Dr. Monroe is her surgeon. She operated on my granddaughter last year, 2 appendicitis. I don't know where we'd be without her." Margaret's throat tightened. Everywhere she turned, there were people praising Dr. Monroe. It made her earlier actions feel all the more shameful. "She must be remarkable," Margaret said softly. The man nodded. "Remarkable is the word. Kind, too. My granddaughter calls her superhero doctor." Margaret's chest ached. She thought of her accusations, her anger, and the moment Dr. Monroe had calmly driven away despite it all. A nurse approached the waiting room and addressed Margaret. "Mrs. Brooks, Dr. Monroe is ready to speak with you." Margaret rose quickly, following the nurse to a small conference room. Dr. Monroe was already there, her professional demeanor in place despite the weariness in her eyes. "Mrs. Brooks," she began, gesturing for Margaret to sit. Margaret hesitated, searching for the right words. "Before you say anything," she blurted out, "I need to apologize again. I misjudged you in a way that I can't even excuse. And now, here you are, saving my son's life. I don't know how to thank you." Dr. Monroe's expression softened, but she remained composed. "Mrs. Brooks, this is not about me. It is about Ethan. He is stable, but he still has a long road to recovery. That is where your focus needs to be." Margaret nodded, her eyes welling with tears. "I understand, but I still want you to know how deeply sorry I am. I was wrong, and I'll never forget that." Dr. Monroe studied her for a moment, then said, "It takes courage to admit when you are wrong. I appreciate your words, Mrs. Brooks, but let's focus on your son's healing. That are what matters now." Margaret spent the rest of the day at Ethan's bedside, her emotions vacillating between relief and self-reproach. The nurses checked in periodically, always kind and reassuring. Each interaction reminded her of how much she had taken for granted the dedication and humanity of people like Dr. Monroe and her team. In the late afternoon, as Ethan stirred slightly in his sleep, Margaret decided she would not let this experience pass without doing something meaningful to make amends. That evening, Margaret returned to the waiting room for a break. She found the older man with the flowers still there. "Any news about your wife?" she asked. He smiled faintly. "She's in recovery now. Dr. Monroe said everything went well." Margaret hesitated, then said, "She operated on my son too. I owe her so much." The man nodded knowingly. "She's a gift, that's for sure." Margaret looked at him, seeing the quiet gratitude in his face. She realized that kindness could ripple outward, touching lives in ways she had never imagined. As she returned to Ethan's room, Margaret resolved to be part of that ripple. Ethan Brooks stirred in his hospital bed, the fog of anesthesia clouding his mind. The faint beeping of the heart monitor was the first sound he registered, a steady rhythm that seemed distant and strange. His body ached, every movement a reminder of the violence of the crash. He tried to piece together what had happened, but the memories were scattered. A curve in the road, the glare of headlights, then nothing. Margaret leaned forward as she noticed Ethan's eyelids flutter. "Ethan?" she said softly, brushing his hair away from his forehead. He blinked, his gaze unfocused at first. Slowly, recognition dawned in his eyes. "Mom?" Relief washed over Margaret like a wave. "I'm here, sweetheart. You're in the hospital, but you're safe now." Ethan tried to speak, but his throat was dry. Margaret quickly poured a small cup of water, holding it to his lips. He sipped carefully, wincing as he swallowed. "What what happened?" he rasped. "You were in a car accident," Margaret explained gently, her voice shaking. "It was bad, but the doctors took care of you. Dr. Monroe saved your life." Ethan's brow furrowed. "Dr. Monroe?" Margaret nodded, swallowing the lump in her throat. "She's a surgeon. You had internal bleeding, but she fixed everything." Ethan managed a faint smile. "Sounds like a superhero." Margaret's chest tightened. "She is," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. As Ethan drifted back to sleep, Margaret sat back in her chair, her thoughts heavy. She had spent the past few days consumed with worry and guilt, but now, with Ethan awake, she allowed herself a moment of gratitude. Dr. Monroe had not only saved her son, but had done so with grace and professionalism, despite everything Margaret had said and done that morning. It humbled her in a way she had never experienced before. Meanwhile, in another part of the hospital, Dr. Celeste Monroe stood at a large glass window overlooking the recovery ward. She held a clipboard in one hand, though she wasn't reading it. Her mind lingered on Ethan's case, and, unexpectedly, on Margaret. The confrontation earlier that day had left an impression not because it was the first time something like that had happened, but because of Margaret's apology. People rarely admitted they were wrong, and even rarer still did they offer a heartfelt apology. Celeste thought of her own experiences growing up. Her path to becoming a surgeon had been paved with challenges, doubts from teachers, dismissive remarks from peers, and the constant need to prove herself in a world that seemed to expect her to fail. She had learned to brush off the assumptions and prejudices, but some moments stuck with her. This one felt different. She shook her head, setting the clipboard down. There were still rounds to complete, and patients like Ethan who needed her focus. Later that afternoon, as Margaret sat by Ethan's bedside, a nurse entered the room with a warm smile. "Mrs. Brooks, Dr. Monroe is making her rounds and will stop by soon," the nurse said. Margaret nodded, suddenly nervous. She wanted to say more to Dr. Monroe, to show her gratitude beyond words. But what could she possibly say that would feel sufficient? Dr. Monroe arrived a short while later, her demeanor calm and professional. She checked Ethan's vitals, asking him a few questions about how he was feeling. Ethan, still groggy but coherent, answered as best he could. "You're healing well," Dr. Monroe said, giving him an encouraging smile. "You're a strong young man." Ethan chuckled weakly. "Thanks to you, I guess." Dr. Monroe's expression softened. "It was a team effort, Ethan. You did your part too." Margaret stood to the side, watching the interaction with a mix of awe and gratitude. When Dr. Monroe turned to leave, Margaret followed her into the hallway. "Dr. Monroe," she called, her voice tentative. Celeste paused, turning back. I need you to know how much this means to me," Margaret said, her voice trembling. "You saved my son. I can never repay you for that." Celeste regarded her quietly for a moment before replying. "Mrs. Brooks, saving lives is what I do. It's why I became a surgeon, but I appreciate your words." Margaret hesitated, then added, "I've been thinking a lot about what happened earlier when I accused you. I let fear and ignorance cloud my judgment. I was wrong, and I'm so sorry." Celeste nodded slowly. "It takes courage to confront our own biases, Mrs. Brooks. That's a start." Margaret felt tears well up again, but this time they were a mix of relief and determination. Later that evening, as Margaret sat by Ethan's bedside, she began to think about what a start truly meant. Dr. Monroe's words lingered in her mind, challenging her to go beyond regret and into action. For years, Margaret had taken her comfortable life for granted, rarely questioning the world beyond her bubble. But now, as she watched her son sleep, she resolved to do better not just for herself, but for Ethan, and for the kind of world she wanted him to grow up in. She would start small, reaching out to her community and learning from those around her. And perhaps one day she could make amends in a way that truly mattered. Margaret stirred awake in the stiff hospital chair, the quiet hum of machines grounding her in the present. Ethan's breathing was steady, his face pale but calm. She stretched, her back protesting the hours spent slouched over. Her thoughts lingered on the previous evening's exchange with Dr. Monroe. Margaret felt restless. It wasn't enough to simply feel regret. She wanted to act. But how? What could she possibly do to make amends for her initial mistrust and the potential harm it had caused? She reached for her phone, scrolling through community groups and initiatives. Nothing stood out until she stumbled upon a local diversity and inclusion seminar at the community center. It was scheduled for later that week. Margaret hesitated, then bookmarked it. She wasn't sure what to expect, but it felt like a small step in the right direction. The morning passed quietly until Ethan stirred, his eyes fluttering open. Margaret leaned forward, her heart leaping. "Hey, sweetheart," she said softly. "Mom," Ethan croaked, his voice weak but steady. Margaret offered him a sip of water, careful not to spill. "How are you feeling?" "Like I got hit by a truck," he joked weakly. Margaret managed a smile, though her chest tightened. "You're lucky, you know. Dr. Monroe said it was touch and go for a while." Ethan frowned slightly. "She saved me." "She did," Margaret confirmed. "She's incredible. I owe her more than I can ever repay." Ethan tilted his head, studying his mother. "You sound different." Margaret paused, realizing how much the events of the past few days had changed her perspective. "I've had a lot to think about," she admitted. Later that afternoon, Dr. Monroe made her rounds, stepping into Ethan's room. Margaret smiled tentatively, her gratitude still bubbling beneath the surface. "Good to see you awake, Ethan," Dr. Monroe said warmly as she checked his vitals. "Thanks to you, I hear," Ethan replied, his tone genuine. Dr. Monroe chuckled softly. "It's a team effort. You've got a strong spirit that helps." Margaret watched the interaction, her admiration for Dr. Monroe deepening. The doctor's calm confidence and steady demeanor had been a lifeline for her and Ethan during this ordeal. "Dr. Monroe," Margaret began, as the surgeon finished her checkup, "do you have a moment?" Dr. Monroe glanced at her schedule. "Of course, let's step into the hallway." Margaret followed her, closing the door softly behind her. She took a breath, steadying herself. "I know I've apologized already," Margaret began, her voice steady, "but I feel like I need to do more. I can't shake the thought of how wrong I was that morning, how I let my fear get the better of me." Dr. Monroe regarded her thoughtfully. "Acknowledging our mistakes is important, but the real question is, what do you plan to do about it?" Margaret nodded, appreciating the directness. "I want to learn, to challenge myself, and be part of the solution, not the problem." Dr. Monroe's expression softened. "That's a good place to start. It's not easy, though. Change takes time, and it takes courage." "I'm willing," Margaret said firmly. Dr. Monroe offered a faint smile. "Then keep going. Educate yourself. Get involved. And most importantly, don't stop when it gets uncomfortable." The conversation left Margaret feeling both hopeful and overwhelmed. As she returned to Ethan's room, she reflected on Dr. Monroe's words. It was time to step outside her comfort zone. The next morning, Margaret found herself at the community center, seated in a circle of strangers. The diversity seminar was already underway, led by a facilitator who encouraged open and honest dialogue. Margaret listened as people shared their experiences with bias, discrimination, and microaggressions. Their stories were raw and eye-opening, and Margaret felt a deep sense of shame for how sheltered she had been. When it was her turn to speak, She hesitated, then said, "I'm here because I want to be better. I recently realized how much harm my assumptions can cause, and I don't want to live that way anymore." The facilitator nodded encouragingly. Acknowledging that is an important first step. As the discussion continued, Margaret felt a shift within herself. The walls she had built around her perceptions were beginning to crumble, leaving room for growth and understanding. That evening, Margaret returned to the hospital with a renewed sense of purpose. She sat beside Ethan's bed, stroking his hand gently. "Mom," Ethan said, his voice stronger than the day before, "what are you thinking about?" Margaret smiled faintly. "About how much I've learned these past few days, and how much more I have to learn." Ethan studied her, a small smile tugging at his lips. "I like this new version of you." Margaret chuckled softly, though tears stung her eyes. "It's about time, isn't it?" Ethan nodded, his eyes heavy with sleep. "Yeah, it is." The next day, Dr. Monroe stopped by for her usual rounds. Margaret seized the moment to express her gratitude again, but this time with a sense of humility and action. "I attended a seminar," Margaret said quietly. "It's a small step, but I wanted you to know that our conversation made a difference." Dr. Monroe's expression softened. "Good for you, Mrs. Brooks. Keep going. The journey isn't easy, but it's worth it." As Dr. Monroe left, Margaret felt a flicker of hope. She still had a long way to go, but she was on the right path. Margaret sat by Ethan's bedside, her hands resting on the edge of his blanket. His color had improved and his breathing was steady, but the bruises on his face and arms were painful reminders of how close they had come to losing him. Dr. Monroe's words from the previous day echoed in Margaret's mind. "The journey isn't easy, but it's worth it." She had been reflecting on that journey, what it meant for her as a mother, a neighbor, and a member of a community she had never fully understood. The hospital had become a strange, insular world for Margaret, filled with the steady beeping of monitors and the quiet shuffle of nurses' footsteps. It was a world she was beginning to see through new eyes. The people who worked tirelessly in this place weren't just professionals. They were human beings with lives, struggles, and triumphs. As the morning sunlight streamed through the window, Ethan stirred. Margaret leaned forward, her heart skipping a beat. "Hey, Mom," he said, his voice raspier than usual. "Good morning, sweetheart," she replied, brushing a strand of hair from his forehead. "How are you feeling?" Ethan shifted slightly, wincing as he moved his shoulder. "Better, I think, but really sore." Margaret smiled gently. "That's to be expected. You've been through a lot." Ethan hesitated, then said, "I've been thinking about what you said about Dr. Monroe." "What about her?" Margaret asked. "She sounds amazing," Ethan said, his tone thoughtful. "I mean, she saved my life, but it's not just that. The way you talk about her, it's like she made you see things differently." Margaret's chest tightened. "She did," she admitted. "I've realized how quick I was to make assumptions, how blind I was to my own biases. Meeting her, it changed something in me." Ethan nodded, his gaze distant. "I wish I could thank her." "You will," Margaret said, squeezing his hand. "When you're stronger, you'll have the chance." Later that day, Margaret decided to take a walk through the hospital corridors. The air was thick with the quiet urgency of care, the low murmur of conversations, the occasional rustle of charts, the soft hum of machines. She passed a small waiting area where a young woman sat, cradling a toddler who was crying softly. Margaret hesitated, then approached. "Is everything okay?" she asked gently. The woman looked up, her face tired but kind. "My son has a fever, and they're running some tests. It's just been a long day." Margaret smiled sympathetically. "I can imagine. Can I get you something? A coffee, maybe?" The woman's eyes widened in surprise. "Oh, that's kind of you, but I wouldn't want to trouble you." "It's no trouble," Margaret insisted. A few minutes later, She returned with 2 steaming cups of coffee from the vending machine. The woman took one with a grateful smile. "Thank you," she said. "It's been a rough few hours, and this means a lot." Margaret sat beside her, sipping her own coffee. They chatted briefly, the conversation light but comforting. As Margaret left, she realized how small acts of kindness could ripple outward, creating connections where there had been none. In the afternoon, Dr. Monroe stopped by Ethan's room for her usual checkup. Margaret stood to the side, watching as the doctor checked vitals and asked Ethan a series of questions. "How's the pain today?" Dr. Monroe asked, making notes on her clipboard. "It's manageable," Ethan replied. "Thanks to you, I guess." Dr. Monroe smiled faintly. "The nurses are the real heroes here. They're the ones keeping you comfortable and on track." As Dr. Monroe finished her notes, Ethan said, "I want to thank you for everything. My mom told me how serious it was. You saved my life." Dr. Monroe paused, her expression softening. "You're welcome, Ethan. But I couldn't have done it without a great team." After she left, Ethan looked at his mother. "She's really humble, isn't she?" Margaret nodded. "Humble, strong, and compassionate. I've learned so much from her in just a few days." Ethan gave her a tired smile. "Sounds like you've met your hero." Margaret chuckled softly. "I think I have." That evening, Margaret attended another session at the community center. This one focused on addressing bias in daily life. The facilitator encouraged participants to share moments when they had realized their own prejudices and how they had worked to change. When it was Margaret's turn, she hesitated, then said, "I recently accused someone of something terrible, simply because I assumed based on appearances. It was wrong, and I've been trying to make amends ever since." The room was quiet, the weight of her words settling over the group. "It's not easy," Margaret continued, her voice steady, "but I've realized that the discomfort is part of the process. If we don't confront our own biases, we can't grow." After the session, several participants approached her, offering encouragement and sharing their own stories. Margaret felt a sense of connection and purpose she hadn't experienced before. Back at the hospital, Margaret returned to Ethan's room to find him asleep. She sat beside him, her mind racing with thoughts of the day. Her encounter with the young mother, her conversation with Dr. Monroe, and the seminar all pointed to one truth. Change was possible, but it required action. Margaret leaned back in her chair, watching the steady rise and fall of Ethan's chest. The journey wasn't over, not for her, not for Ethan, and not for the countless others affected by prejudice and bias. But for the first time, she felt ready to face it, one step at a time. The hospital room was quiet, the soft hum of machinery blending with the muted sounds of activity in the hallway. Margaret sat in her usual chair by Ethan's bedside, watching the gentle rise and fall of his chest as he slept. He looked better, his color had improved, and the swelling around his bruises was beginning to subside. She glanced at her phone. It was filled with emails and messages that she had ignored for days, but one stood out, a notification about a follow-up session at the community center. This one focusing on building bridges within the community. Margaret hesitated before clicking on it, but something compelled her to RSVP. This wasn't just about her anymore. It was about the world Ethan would grow up in and the examples she set for him. Later that morning, Dr. Monroe entered the room, clipboard in hand. She greeted Margaret with a nod and smiled warmly at Ethan, who was awake and propped up on a pillow. "How are we feeling today?" she asked, setting the clipboard down. "Better," Ethan said with a small smile. "Still sore, but I think I'm getting used to it." Dr. Monroe chuckled softly. "That's a good sign. Your body is healing. You'll need physical therapy once you're discharged, but with time and effort, you'll be back to your old self." Ethan's smile faded slightly. "It's just hard to think about all that happened." Dr. Monroe's expression softened. "That's normal, Ethan. Trauma affects more than just the body, it stays in the mind and heart. But healing isn't something you do alone. Lean on the people who care about you and take it one day at a time. Margaret watched the exchange, her admiration for Dr. Monroe growing. The surgeon wasn't just treating Ethan's injuries, she was offering him hope and reassurance. As Dr. Monroe finished her notes, Ethan said, "Dr. Monroe, do you ever get tired of doing what you do? I mean, it must be so hard sometimes." Dr. Monroe paused, considering the question. "It is hard," she admitted. "There are long hours, tough decisions, and moments that stay with you. But I keep going because I believe in what I do. Every life saved is a victory, and every challenge is an opportunity to grow." Ethan nodded, a thoughtful expression on his face. Before leaving, Dr. Monroe turned to Margaret. "He's making excellent progress. I'll be back this afternoon to check in again." "Thank you," Margaret said, her voice filled with genuine gratitude. That afternoon, Margaret decided to step outside for fresh air. She found a bench in the small hospital garden and sat down, the crisp autumn air cooling her skin. She noticed a nurse sitting nearby, reading a book. Margaret hesitated before speaking. "You work with Dr. Monroe, don't you?" The nurse looked up and smiled. "I do. She's an amazing surgeon and a good person, too." Margaret nodded, her thoughts swirling. "She's done so much for my son. I don't know how to thank her." The nurse closed her book, her smile turning reflective. "Dr. Monroe doesn't do this for recognition. She's passionate about helping people, and that's thanks enough for her. But if you want to honor her work, maybe you could pay it forward, help someone else in need." Margaret considered this. She thought of the seminar she had attended and the follow-up session she had signed up for. Maybe paying it forward wasn't just about grand gestures. It was about the little things that added up to something bigger. That evening, Margaret returned to the hospital. Ethan was awake, scrolling through his phone. "Mom," he said, looking up, "I've been reading about car accidents and recovery stories. Some of them are really inspiring." Margaret sat down beside him. "What do you mean?" "People who've been through tough times but found ways to turn it around," Ethan explained. "It's like they didn't let what happened define them. They used it to grow." Margaret smiled softly. "You're stronger than you think, Ethan. You've already come so far." Ethan nodded. "I've been thinking about Dr. Monroe. She must see people at their worst moments, but she still believes in them. That's pretty incredible." Margaret's heart swelled with pride. Ethan was beginning to see the same qualities in Dr. Monroe that had changed her own perspective. The next day, Margaret attended the follow-up session at the community center. The room was filled with people from all walks of life, sharing stories of challenges and growth. When it was her turn to speak, Margaret stood, her voice steady but emotional. "My son was in a car accident recently," she began. "And during that time, I had an encounter that changed the way I see the world. I made a mistake, a big one, because of my own assumptions. But instead of holding it against me, the person I wronged showed grace and kindness. It made me realize how much I have to learn and how much more I can do to make a difference." The room was quiet as she spoke, the weight of her words sinking in. "I've started taking small steps," Margaret continued. "I know I can't change the past, but I can work to create a better future for my son, for my community, and for myself." When she finished, the group applauded, and several people approached her afterward to share their support. That evening, Margaret returned to the hospital feeling lighter. She told Ethan about the session, and he listened intently, his admiration for his mother clear. "I'm proud of you, Mom," he said, his voice sincere. Margaret smiled, her eyes brimming with tears. "I'm proud of you too, sweetheart." As she sat by his bedside, she thought about the barriers she had begun to break within herself, within her community, and within the relationships she was building. And she knew that this was only the beginning. The morning sunlight streamed through the hospital window, casting warm patterns on the tiled floor. Ethan sat propped up in bed, his complexion brighter than it had been in days. Margaret had brought him a book he'd been wanting to read, and he was thumbing through the pages, his concentration deep. Margaret watched him with quiet gratitude. Every day brought a little more healing, a little more hope. But her own journey was far from over. Dr. Monroe's influence had planted a seed of change in her, one that Margaret was determined to nurture. As she reached for her cup of coffee, the door opened, and Dr. Monroe stepped inside. "Good morning, Ethan," she said with a warm smile. "How's my favorite patient today?" Ethan grinned. "Feeling stronger? Mom even says I might be walking around soon." Dr. Monroe nodded, pleased. "That's the plan. Physical therapy will help you rebuild your strength, but you're making excellent progress." Margaret stood, her nerves fluttering. She had been thinking about this moment for days. "Dr. Monroe," she began, her voice steady but laced with emotion. "Can I have a moment with you after this? There's something I'd like to share." Dr. Monroe regarded her thoughtfully and nodded. "Of course." After completing her rounds with Ethan, Dr. Monroe gestured for Margaret to follow her into the hallway. They stopped by a quiet alcove near the nurses' station, the buzz of activity around them creating a soft, background hum. "What's on your mind, Mrs. Brooks?" Dr. Monroe asked, her tone calm and inviting. Margaret took a deep breath. "I wanted to thank you again, not just for saving Ethan's life, but for the grace and patience you've shown me. I've spent these past days reflecting on what happened and how I let my assumptions cloud my judgment. And while I know words alone aren't enough, I wanted you to know that I've started taking steps to change." Dr. Monroe's expression softened. "That's commendable. Change isn't easy, but it's important work." Margaret nodded, a flicker of hope sparking within her. "I've been attending seminars, listening to other people's experiences, and challenging myself to step outside my comfort zone. It's been eye-opening." Dr. Monroe smiled faintly. "It sounds like you're on the right path. The fact that you're willing to do the work says a lot." Margaret hesitated, then added, "I also wanted to ask, how can I support you and others like you? I feel like I've spent so much of my life taking people like you for granted. I want to do better." Dr. Monroe's gaze softened further. "Start by continuing what you're doing. Educate yourself, listen, and advocate when you see injustice. And don't underestimate the power of kindness. It has a ripple effect that goes further than you can imagine." Margaret felt tears prick her eyes, but they were tears of gratitude and resolve. "Thank you," she said quietly. Dr. Monroe offered her a small but genuine smile before excusing herself to continue her rounds. That afternoon, Margaret stepped outside for a walk in the hospital's garden. She spotted the same young mother she had seen days earlier, this time sitting on a bench with her son, who was happily munching on crackers. Margaret hesitated, then approached. "Hello again," she said, smiling. The woman looked up, recognition dawning in her eyes. "Oh, hi, I remember you. How's your son?" Margaret nodded, her smile widening. "He's doing much better, thank you. How about your little one?" The woman stroked her son's hair. "He's improving. It's been a tough week, but the staff here has been wonderful." Margaret sat down beside her. "They really are," she agreed. "My son wouldn't be here if it weren't for Dr. Monroe and the amazing team here." The woman smiled. "Dr. Monroe, she's incredible. She helped my sister-in-law last year complications during childbirth. Everyone in my family thinks the world of her." Margaret felt her admiration for Dr. Monroe deepen. "She's made a big impact on my family too," she said. As they continued talking, Margaret shared her journey over the past few days, her mistakes, her realizations, and her determination to change. The young mother listened intently, nodding in understanding. "You're doing something a lot of people wouldn't," the woman said. "It takes courage to admit you were wrong and work to make it right." Margaret felt a wave of warmth at the woman's words. "Thank you," she said sincerely. When Margaret returned to Ethan's room, he was sitting up, flipping through the book she had brought him. "How was your walk?" he asked. "It was good," Margaret said, sitting down. "I met the woman I told you about, the one with the little boy. She reminded me how important it is to keep going, even when it's hard." Ethan closed his book and looked at her thoughtfully. "You've been doing a lot of that lately." Margaret smiled faintly. "It's because of you, Ethan. I want to be someone you can look up to, someone who sets an example worth following." "You already are," Ethan said, his voice quiet but firm. Margaret's heart swelled. She reached out and squeezed his hand, feeling a renewed sense of purpose. That evening, as Margaret prepared to settle in for the night, she received an email from the community center about an upcoming workshop on allyship and advocacy. Without hesitation, she registered for it, determined to continue the work she had started. She glanced at Ethan, who was sleeping soundly, his breathing steady and peaceful. The journey ahead still felt daunting, but for the first time, Margaret felt truly equipped to face it. She had been given grace when she least deserved it, and now she intended to pass that grace forward. The days passed in a quiet rhythm. Ethan's condition improved steadily, his strength returning with each physical therapy session. Margaret spent most of her time at his side, offering encouragement and reading aloud from his favorite books. But her mind often wandered, turning over the lessons she had been learning since that fateful morning when she first met Dr. Monroe. Margaret attended another workshop at the community center, this one focused on how to be an effective ally. The facilitator, a charismatic woman named Clara, spoke passionately about the importance of taking meaningful action. "Being an ally is about more than words," Clara said, pacing the room. "It's about showing up, speaking out, and making space for voices that have been silenced." Margaret listened intently, taking notes. When the floor opened for questions, she raised her hand. "I've been reflecting on my own biases," Margaret said, her voice steady despite her nerves. "And I've been trying to educate myself and do better. But sometimes I worry, what if I make another mistake?" Clara smiled kindly. "Making mistakes is part of the process. The important thing is how you respond. If you mess up, own it, apologize, and learn from it. Don't let fear keep you from trying." Margaret nodded, the words resonating deeply. Back at the hospital, Margaret shared what she had learned with Ethan. He was sitting up in bed, his physical therapist having just left after their latest session. "You're really doing all this?" Ethan asked, his voice a mix of curiosity and admiration. Margaret nodded, sitting beside him. "I realized I've spent too much of my life being comfortable. It's time to step out of that bubble and start making a difference." Ethan smiled faintly. "I think it's pretty cool, Mom." Margaret chuckled softly. "Thanks, sweetheart. That means a lot." That afternoon, Dr. Monroe stopped by for her rounds. Ethan greeted her with a smile, his progress evident in the way he sat up straighter and spoke with more energy. "You're looking stronger every day," Dr. Monroe said, checking his vitals. "Feeling better too," Ethan replied. "Thanks to you." Dr. Monroe gave a modest smile. "You're the one putting in the work. I'm just here to guide you." As she made notes on her clipboard, Margaret cleared her throat. "Dr. Monroe, can I ask you something?" "Of course," the doctor replied, turning her attention to Margaret. Margaret hesitated, then said, "Do you ever feel discouraged? Like the work you're doing isn't enough?" Dr. Monroe considered the question. "There are days when it feels overwhelming," she admitted. "The challenges can be daunting, and the progress can feel slow. But then I see patients like Ethan, who fight through their own challenges with strength and resilience, and it reminds me why I do this." Margaret nodded, her admiration for the doctor deepening. "I've been trying to make changes in my own life, attending workshops, learning from others, but sometimes it feels like such a small drop in a very large bucket." Dr. Monroe's expression softened. "Every drop counts, Mrs. Brooks. Change doesn't happen overnight, and no one can do it alone. But together, those small efforts add up to something meaningful. Margaret felt a surge of hope at the words. "Thank you," she said quietly. Later that evening, Margaret received a call from Mrs. Harris, her elderly next-door neighbor. "Margaret, I just wanted to check in," Mrs. Harris said warmly. "I've been thinking about you and Ethan. How's he doing?" Margaret smiled, touched by the gesture. "He's doing well, Mrs. Harris. Thank you for asking." "That's wonderful to hear," Mrs. Harris replied. "And how are you holding up?" Margaret hesitated, then said, "It's been a challenging time, but also an eye-opening one. I've learned a lot about myself and about the changes I need to make." Mrs. Harris chuckled softly. "Growth is never easy, my dear, but it's always worth it. If there's anything I can do to help, just say the word." Margaret felt a lump in her throat. "Thank you, Mrs. Harris. That means so much." After the call, Margaret sat by the window, looking out at the quiet street below. The kindness of people like Mrs. Harris and the wisdom of Dr. Monroe had reminded her that she wasn't alone in this journey. The next day, Margaret returned to the community center for another workshop. This time she felt more confident, more grounded in her purpose. She shared her story with the group, talking openly about her mistakes and the steps she was taking to make amends. One participant, a young man named Jordan, approached her afterward. "I just wanted to say thank you," Jordan said. "Hearing your story gives me hope that people can change." Margaret felt a surge of gratitude. "Thank you for saying that," she replied. "It means a lot." That evening, Margaret sat by Ethan's bedside, watching him sleep. She thought about the journey they had both been on, how it had brought them closer, and opened her eyes to a world she had barely understood before. As she reflected, a quiet determination settled over her. She couldn't undo the past, but she could shape the future, and she was ready to keep moving forward, one step at a time. The morning sunlight poured into the hospital room, brighter and warmer than it had been in days. Ethan sat upright in his bed, his recovery now well underway. His bruises had faded, and his energy had returned in small but noticeable increments. Margaret sat nearby, her coffee cooling in her hands, as she flipped through a brochure the hospital staff had given her about rehabilitation services. "Looks like you'll be starting physical therapy next week," Margaret said, glancing up at Ethan with a smile. "Can't wait," Ethan replied with a grin. "Anything to get out of this bed." Margaret laughed, relief and gratitude evident in her voice. "That's the spirit." The door opened, and Dr. Monroe stepped in, clipboard in hand. She gave them both a warm smile, her presence as steadying as ever. "Good morning," she said, her tone as calm and professional as always. "Morning, Dr. Monroe," Ethan replied enthusiastically. Dr. Monroe reviewed Ethan's chart, her eyes scanning the numbers with a satisfied nod. "You're looking great, Ethan. Your progress is remarkable. If everything continues as it has been, you should be ready for discharge in a few days." "That's amazing news," Margaret said, her relief palpable. "Thank you, Dr. Monroe, truly." Dr. Monroe smiled modestly. "It's a team effort, as always. But Ethan's resilience and your support have been key." As she made her notes, Ethan leaned forward slightly. "Dr. Monroe, can I ask you something?" "Of course," she said, looking up. "When you're not working here, do you do other things to help people?" Ethan asked curiously. Dr. Monroe smiled thoughtfully. "I do what I can. I'm involved in mentoring programs for young people interested in medicine, especially those who come from underrepresented backgrounds. I also volunteer at community health clinics when time allows." Ethan nodded, impressed. "That's really cool. You're kind of like a superhero." Dr. Monroe chuckled softly. "Not quite, but I do believe in using my skills to make a difference." Margaret watched the exchange, her admiration for Dr. Monroe growing with every word. Later that day, after Dr. Monroe had left, Margaret decided to act on an idea that had been forming in her mind. She pulled out her phone and began drafting an email to the hospital's administration. In the email, she detailed her family's experience and the incredible care they had received, singling out Dr. Monroe for her exceptional professionalism, compassion, and expertise. Margaret ended the email with a request that the hospital recognize Dr. Monroe's contributions in a meaningful way, whether through an award or a public acknowledgement. After pressing send, Margaret felt a sense of purpose. It was a small gesture, but it felt significant, a way to honor the woman who had saved her son's life and opened her eyes to so much more. The next morning, Margaret received a call from the hospital's administrator thanking her for the glowing feedback. They promised to share her message with the staff and take her recommendation into consideration. Margaret smiled, knowing she had taken another step toward building bridges and spreading kindness. On the day of Ethan's discharge, the hospital room buzzed with activity. Nurses came and went, giving final instructions and helping Ethan prepare. Margaret packed their belongings, pausing now and then to glance at her son, who was sitting in a wheelchair, looking eager to leave. As they were about to head out, Dr. Monroe arrived to see them off. "Well, Ethan," she said with a smile, "this is it. You're officially on your way to recovery." "Thanks to you," Ethan said, his gratitude evident. Dr. Monroe crouched slightly to meet his eye level. "Remember, healing takes time, and it's okay to lean on the people around you. You're stronger than you think." Ethan nodded, his eyes bright. "I won't forget." Dr. Monroe stood and turned to Margaret. "Mrs. Brooks, it's been a pleasure working with your family. I wish you both the best." Margaret stepped forward, her voice steady but emotional. "Dr. Monroe, I can't thank you enough, not just for saving Ethan, but for everything you've taught me. You've changed the way I see the world." Dr. Monroe smiled warmly. "That means a lot to hear. Keep doing the work, Mrs. Brooks. It makes a difference." The ride home was quiet, but filled with unspoken reflection. As Margaret pulled into the driveway, she noticed her neighbor, Mrs. Harris, tending to her flower beds. Mrs. Harris waved, her face lighting up as Margaret and Ethan stepped out of the car. "Welcome home, Ethan," Mrs. Harris called, her joy genuine. "Thanks, Mrs. Harris," Ethan replied, leaning on his crutches. Margaret walked over to her neighbor, her gratitude spilling over. "Thank you for everything, Mrs. Harris, for checking on us and for your kindness." Mrs. Harris patted Margaret's arm. "That's what neighbors are for, dear, and it's so good to see Ethan back on his feet." As Margaret and Ethan entered their home, Margaret felt a deep sense of peace. The journey they had been on, the lessons, the challenges, and the kindness they had received had reshaped her world. In the weeks that followed, Margaret continued her work at the community center, attending workshops and volunteering for outreach programs. She also started a small initiative in her neighborhood to foster dialogue and understanding among residents. Ethan's recovery progressed steadily, and he even began joining his mother at some of the community events, sharing his own story and learning alongside her. One evening, as Margaret sat on the porch, sipping tea and watching the sunset, her phone buzzed with an email notification. It was from the hospital, announcing that Dr. Monroe had been recognized with an award for her outstanding contributions to patient care and community outreach. Margaret smiled, her heart full. As the sun dipped below the horizon, painting the sky in hues of orange and pink, Margaret reflected on the journey that had brought her to this moment. The road had been difficult, filled with painful realizations and moments of vulnerability, but it had also been transformative. She had learned that growth was possible, that kindness could ripple outward, and that even the smallest actions could lead to meaningful change. And as she sat there, watching the world settle into evening, Margaret felt ready for whatever lay ahead, a new beginning, grounded in perseverance, kindness, and hope. As Margaret learned, small acts of kindness and a willingness to change can ripple outward, creating meaningful transformations in our lives and communities. If you found this story inspiring, make sure to give this video a thumbs up and share it with someone who might need to hear it. And don't forget to subscribe to our channel for more powerful and uplifting stories that remind us of the strength in empathy, growth, and hope. Click the bell icon so you never miss a new story.